I was once called doctor with respect that filled corridors before my footsteps even arrived, a time when white coats were not costumes for social media but symbols of sacrifice, nights without sleep, and hands that shook not from age but from responsibility. Yet time has a cruel way of reducing legacies into wrinkles and slowing gaits, and when I retired from active practice, I did not retire from purpose. I chose to mentor young medical personnel because medicine is not learned only from textbooks but from scars, from mistakes that textbooks never record, from patients whose names you remember long after you forget the date. But the laughter began subtly, whispers during lectures, smirks when I mispronounced a modern abbreviation, eyes glued to phones while I spoke about ethics, humility, and the cost of arrogance. Some of them laughed openly, calling me outdated, saying medicine had evolved past my era, that machines knew more than old men, and each laugh landed softly at first, then deeper, like needles pushing through pride into something more painful, dignity. Yet I smiled because experience teaches patience before reaction. One afternoon a young intern openly mocked my tremor while I demonstrated a technique. The room laughed, and I felt something break quietly inside me, not anger, not hatred, but a heavy realization that knowledge without humility becomes cruelty. I said nothing. I simply stopped teaching. Weeks passed, and the hospital noticed something missing but could not name it. Then the incident happened, a critical emergency, a rare complication that textbooks barely touch and machines cannot predict. Panic filled the ward, protocols failed, confidence collapsed. The same young doctors who laughed now ran in circles searching databases, calling consultants, losing time, and then someone remembered me, the old doctor, retired but still around. They came to my door not with laughter but fear, and I saw it in their eyes, the moment arrogance meets reality. I did not refuse. Revenge does not always wear cruelty, sometimes it wears restraint. I walked slowly into the ward, corrected one decision, adjusted another, guided hands with calm, and saved a life without raising my voice. The room was silent, no applause, only shame. Later I was asked to speak, and I did not accuse, I did not insult, I simply told stories. About doctors who buried patients because they trusted ego over experience, about mistakes that haunt dreams. About how laughter today becomes regret tomorrow. Some cried quietly, others avoided my eyes, and the young intern who mocked me apologized publicly, his voice shaking, not because he was told to, but because he understood. Weeks later the hospital created a mentorship policy built around respect for experience. My name was attached to it without my request. Invitations came from institutions that once ignored me. But the greatest revenge was not recognition, it was transformation. I watched those same young doctors slow down, listen more, speak softer, and teach juniors with humility. Laughter replaced by gratitude. And when I finally walked away for good, I did not leave bitterness behind. I left a lesson carved into their careers, that time humbles everyone, that wisdom ages but never expires, and that the most dangerous disease in medicine is not ignorance but arrogance, because one day, every young doctor becomes old, and on that day, they will hope someone listens. Time passed, but consequences have long memories. The mentorship program grew, yet not everyone learned at the same speed. A few still believed skill alone made them untouchable. One in particular rose quickly, brilliant on paper, admired online, praised for speed rather than judgment, and I watched quietly as shortcuts replaced caution, until another case arrived, not dramatic, not loud, but subtle, the kind that destroys lives slowly if mishandled. The young doctor dismissed my earlier warnings recorded in training sessions, chose confidence over consultation, and when the outcome failed, the weight fell on him alone. Investigations followed, questions echoed, and suddenly experience became the currency he lacked. He came to me late one evening, not as a superior or a critic, but as a man broken by regret. He asked how I would have handled it, and I told him the truth. That medicine is not about never failing but about knowing when you don't know enough, that every scar on my hands was earned through humility, not brilliance. His career survived but his pride did not, and that was the destruction, mild yet permanent. From that day he became careful, slower, kinder, and years later he stood beside me during my final farewell, telling new interns my story not as a warning wrapped in fear but as a lesson wrapped in respect. And as I left the hospital for the last time, I realized revenge does not always end in applause or downfall. Sometimes it ends in quieter wards. Saved lives, humbled hearts, and a generation that learns too late but not too late to change. The letters began arriving after I left, handwritten, hesitant, heavy with words people only find when pride is gone. Young doctors writing about moments they almost made irreversible mistakes and remembered my voice. Nurses thanking me for teaching them to speak up when something felt wrong. Even administrators admitting that progress without memory is dangerous. One message stood out, from the intern who first laughed at me. He wrote about a patient he lost early in his career, how confidence Made him deaf to caution, how the weight of that loss followed him home every night, and how he finally understood that my tremor was not weakness but the echo of lives once held too tightly to forget. I never replied. Some lessons must sit quietly in the heart to grow. Months later I was invited to a graduation ceremony, not to speak but to sit, yet when the microphone failed and silence filled the hall, they asked me to stand. I spoke briefly, told them medicine is a long road where the young borrow confidence and the old carry memory, where laughter fades but consequences remain. I told them respect is not for age but for experience earned through pain, and when I finished there was no clapping at first, only stillness. Then one by one they stood, not for me, but for the lesson, and as I walked away that evening, slower than before but lighter inside, I knew the revenge was complete, not because anyone fell, but because arrogance did, replaced by humility that would save people I would never meet. And that is how an old doctor finally rests, not remembered for anger, but for the quiet correction of many futures. Years later illness visited me quietly, the kind that does not announce itself with alarms, only with fatigue and reflection, and as I sat by the window counting breaths instead of heartbeats, news still reached me: a rural clinic named after the mentorship values I taught, a policy mandating senior consultation before critical decisions, young doctors requesting retired consultants instead of ignoring them. The world I feared was forgetting slowly corrected itself, one life at a time. Then one evening a young doctor arrived unannounced, now older, eyes tired but steady. He told me he almost quit medicine, said the pressure, the guilt, the expectations were crushing him, but remembering my restraint that day in the ward saved him, not just a patient, but his own future. He thanked me for choosing dignity over humiliation, for teaching revenge without cruelty. When he left I understood something deeply. Destruction does not always look like ruin. Sometimes it looks like the death of arrogance, the collapse of careless laughter, the quiet burial of ego. And when my hands finally stilled, I left knowing my greatest victory was not proving them wrong, but allowing them to become right in time, and that lesson, once learned, would outlive both youth and age. The final lesson came without a classroom, without an audience, only memory. As I lay surrounded not by machines but by silence, I thought of every face that once laughed and later learned, every hand that trembled not from age but from responsibility, and I realized medicine is a mirror. It reflects who you are before it reveals what you know. Arrogance cracks it, humility cleans it. Somewhere in those halls young doctors now pause before acting, not because they fear mistakes, but because they respect consequences, and that pause saves lives. Long after my name fades from files and walls, my story remains in their instincts, in the moment they choose to listen instead of laugh, to ask instead of assume, to slow down when speed feels powerful. And that is how the old doctor's revenge ends, not with bitterness, not with downfall, but with a generation quietly changed, carrying forward a lesson written not in anger, but in restraint, regret, empathy, and the understanding that wisdom does not demand attention, it waits patiently until it is needed. After my passing they found my old notebooks, margins filled with observations no database could store, notes about fear in a patient's eyes, about when to speak softly and when to act fast. The hospital archived them at first, then slowly they became required reading, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest, mistakes included. And the laughter that once followed my steps was replaced by quiet respect when new interns were told how arrogance almost cost lives before humility saved them. One nurse said the story changed how she spoke up during rounds. Another doctor admitted he paused during a critical call because he remembered that silence can be safer than speed. And somewhere in those corridors my presence lingered not as a ghost but as a habit of listening, of checking twice, of respecting those who walked the path before. And that is where the revenge truly lived, not in any single moment, but in thousands of small decisions shaped by regret they did not have to personally endure, a legacy built not on applause but on restraint. And as medicine continues to evolve beyond my years, one truth remains untouched: knowledge grows, machines advance, youth rises, but wisdom survives only when someone chooses to honor it, even when it arrives with wrinkles, a slow step, and a trembling hand. Long after the notebooks became routine and my name softened into history, a new generation arrived, confident, brilliant, loud in a way youth always is, and I was no longer there to be laughed at or defended. Yet my lesson faced its final test. One young resident dismissed a senior nurse's concern during a night shift. The nurse insisted, hesitated, remembered the story they were taught, and spoke again. The resident paused, checked, corrected, and avoided a fatal error. Later he admitted he almost brushed it off, said something in his training stopped him, not fear of punishment, but respect for voices shaped by time. And that moment mattered more than any ceremony ever did, because it proved the lesson had detached from me and attached itself to behavior, the purest form of impact. And as years rolled on medicine kept changing, screens brighter, tools smarter, attention shorter, But whenever arrogance tried to grow roots, someone would quietly recall the old retired doctor who never shouted, never humiliated, never struck back, yet changed everything by allowing regret to teach where anger could not, and in that quiet continuity the revenge remained complete, gentle yet irreversible, a reminder that dignity outlasts mockery, humility outlives brilliance, and wisdom, once ignored, always has the patience to wait for its moment to save the world again. In the end there was no statue, no grand title etched in stone, only habits passed down like inheritance, a way of listening before speaking, of checking before acting, of honoring those whose years carried unseen costs, and whenever a young doctor felt tempted to laugh at age or dismiss a slow voice, something inside them hesitated, a quiet resistance they could not explain, and that hesitation became the shield between confidence and catastrophe, between pride and regret, and so my story never needed an ending because it kept living in pauses, in softened tones, in second opinions requested without shame. The mild revenge had done its work, not by breaking people, but by reshaping them, teaching that true power in medicine is not how fast you move or how loud you speak, but how deeply you respect life, experience, and the fragile space between knowing and assuming, and that lesson, once learned, cannot be unlearned. It follows every doctor into every room, whispering gently. That wisdom does not fade with age, it only waits for humility to recognize it. Even now, when discussions grow heated and certainty feels intoxicating, someone always slows the room, a senior consultant clearing a throat, a nurse raising a hand, a junior doctor asking one more question, and that moment of slowing is where lives are quietly rescued. They do not know my face, some do not know my name, but they know the rule that saved them, that no voice shaped by years should be ignored, that laughter has consequences. That humility is not weakness but protection, and so, the cycle that once began with mockery ends with mindfulness, not because fear was taught, but because regret was witnessed secondhand, and as medicine continues its endless march forward, my mild revenge remains stitched into its fabric, unseen yet unremovable, a soft resistance against arrogance, a reminder that progress without respect is just speed toward error, and somewhere beyond halls and titles, the old doctor rests, knowing the greatest justice is not being proven right, but ensuring others never have to learn the same lesson the hard way. And when the youngest among them eventually become the oldest in the room, when their hands slow and their voices soften, they recognize the cycle with a quiet smile. They see echoes of their former selves in impatient eyes and restless confidence, and instead of bitterness they choose patience, because they remember how arrogance once stood where they now stand, and how it was not crushed but corrected. They tell the story not as legend but as warning wrapped in mercy. They remind the young that time is the one opponent no brilliance defeats, that every laugh aimed at age is a laugh aimed at their own future, and so the lesson renews itself, generation after generation, not enforced, not feared, but respected, and that is how the mild revenge achieves immortality, not through destruction of people, but through the permanent dismantling of pride, leaving behind doctors who heal not only with skill, but with humility, empathy, and restraint, and in that quiet inheritance, the retired doctor's purpose completes its final breath. Knowing the world did not change loudly, but it changed correctly. Even decades later, stories of the old doctor who never shouted still circulate quietly in hospital corridors, shared in whispers between interns during night shifts, recounted by nurses who learned to speak up, remembered by consultants who once ignored caution, and in each telling, the laughter of the past is replaced by reflection, a subtle, almost invisible transformation. Young doctors pause before acting, double-check before assuming, and sometimes they turn to the patient and simply listen, truly listen, in ways I never could enforce, for true influence cannot be demanded, only witnessed and adopted, and in those small choices lives are saved, mistakes avoided, and arrogance contained. My mild revenge persists not as spectacle but as practice, a living ethic woven into habits, proving that the most lasting justice is not confrontation, not destruction, but the slow, steady correction of hearts and minds. And as the hospital continues to grow, new wings, new technology, new names on doors, the lesson quietly thrives, wisdom ages, pride fades, and respect, earned, observed, and remembered, endures forever. Over time I realized that the true measure of my influence was not in headlines, awards, or recognition, but in the moments that no one recorded, the pause before a procedure, the question asked twice, the hand that hesitated before acting, the eye that caught a small detail no machine could detect, and each of these moments carried my quiet revenge, gentle yet permanent, reshaping decisions without shouting, correcting arrogance without humiliation, and teaching humility without force. Families Unknowingly saved, mistakes averted, careers redirected, all because a generation once laughed at age and in return learned to honor experience, and in those invisible victories, I found a satisfaction that no applause could rival, knowing that my presence, though absent, had become a standard, a safeguard, a legacy written not in anger but in restraint, empathy, and the subtle, enduring power of patience. And then came the realization that my mild revenge had extended beyond individual doctors. It had seeped into the culture of the hospital itself, shaping policies, approaches, and expectations in ways no single lecture or warning could ever achieve. Meetings now included voices previously ignored, juniors were encouraged to challenge assumptions respectfully, seniors remembered that authority is not license, and even technology was approached with caution, a tool to assist, never replace, human judgment. And in every corrected path, in every life saved because someone chose to pause, my presence lingered, not as a ghost but as a principle, a quiet insistence that arrogance cannot thrive when humility is practiced, and that lesson, patiently repeated over decades, became immortal, carried forward not by my name but by the countless small choices inspired by the knowledge that laughter at age or experience can have consequences far beyond a moment, shaping entire futures, entire careers, entire lives. I watched from a distance, in the quiet moments of reflection, as young doctors I had never met began to mentor others in the same way I once had, not because they sought revenge or recognition, but because they had internalized the principle, experience matters, humility saves, and mistakes are teachers when pride is set aside, and it struck me that the mildest form of revenge, the one that teaches rather than punishes, was also the most enduring, for it outlives anger, outlasts memory, and continues to shape hearts long after the teacher has gone. And in that continuity, I finally understood that true impact in medicine, as in life, is not measured by applause or fear, but by the invisible threads of wisdom woven into decisions, actions, and lives. A quiet legacy that ensures laughter at the wrong moment is replaced by reflection, arrogance yields to respect, and humanity, at its most fragile and most brilliant, survives. And so, even as the years took me further from the hospital halls I once walked, my influence continued quietly, almost invisibly, in the decisions of those I had taught, directly or indirectly, in the nurses who now spoke up without hesitation, in the interns who double-checked every procedure, in the young doctors who learned to listen before acting, and even in the seasoned consultants who now remembered to pause and reflect before assuming. And I realized that mild revenge, tempered with patience and empathy, had become a living force, not through destruction but through subtle transformation, a lesson repeated over and over until arrogance could no longer grow unchecked, humility became the default, and respect, earned, observed, and remembered, was the foundation of every action. And in that enduring change, I understood at last that the old doctor's victory was complete, not because anyone had fallen, but because the culture itself had changed, quietly, permanently, and wisely. And yet, the story did not end with me. Long after my hands were still and my voice no longer heard, the seeds I had sown continued to grow in ways I could never have predicted. Young doctors who had once doubted experience now shared it with their juniors, nurses remembered to insist when something felt wrong, and the hospital itself began to thrive not only on skill but on mindfulness, empathy, and restraint. Mistakes once common became rare. Arrogance now met with reflection rather than mockery, and I realized that mild revenge, delivered without malice but with quiet insistence, had outlasted me, outlasted time, and outlasted pride, leaving behind a legacy that was not about proving anyone wrong, but about saving lives, shaping minds, and ensuring that respect for experience became a permanent, living part of medicine, a lesson repeated silently, patiently, endlessly, until it could not be ignored. And in those final reflections, I understood the full depth of what had been accomplished. Laughter that once sought to diminish now became memory that instructs, arrogance that once threatened patients' lives was replaced by caution, empathy, and vigilance, and every small decision made decades later, by doctors who never met me, by nurses who only heard the story secondhand, was quietly shaped by the principles I had lived and taught, a chain of influence stretching far beyond my presence, far beyond any single hospital. And I realized that true revenge is not destruction, it is transformation, not humiliation, but correction, not anger, but patience. And in that enduring, invisible, unstoppable ripple through the lives of countless people, the old doctor finally rested with peace, knowing that every patient saved, every mistake avoided, and every humble choice made in the years after his retirement was the ultimate vindication, not of pride, but of purpose. And that is how a life dedicated to medicine, once mocked, became a lesson no laughter could ever erase. Even as decades passed, the story continued to ripple outward in ways I could never have anticipated. Young doctors now teaching their juniors to listen first, to observe before acting, to honor the wisdom in every wrinkle and trembling hand, and even the hospital's culture transformed, no longer a place where speed or pride defined competence, but where thoughtfulness, caution, and empathy became standard. Policies evolved to include mentorship and reflection, and subtle traditions emerged. A moment of pause before critical decisions. A hand raised to ask questions without fear, a quiet acknowledgement of experience before action, and in every one of these moments, I realized that my mild revenge had transcended me, no longer about the young doctors who once laughed, but about a system that could now prevent arrogance from ever causing harm again, a lasting, invisible legacy that would endure long after names were forgotten, a gentle, unstoppable proof that true power lies not in proving others wrong, but in teaching them to be right. And as I watched from afar, I began to notice something even deeper. The lesson I had left behind was no longer tied to me at all. It had become a living part of the hospital's rhythm, woven into the instincts of every doctor, nurse, and trainee. Decisions were tempered with reflection, questions were welcomed rather than dismissed, and empathy guided actions as much as knowledge did. Mistakes that once might have gone unnoticed were caught in time, lives were quietly saved every day. I realized then that mild revenge, delivered not through anger but through example, had achieved something far greater than personal vindication. It had reshaped a culture, instilled humility, and taught that respect and experience carry a weight machines, accolades, or youth can never replace. And in that subtle, enduring transformation, I finally understood, the old doctor's power had never been in shouting or proving anyone wrong. It had always been in the patient, unyielding force of quiet wisdom, leaving a legacy that would continue to guide countless lives long after I was gone. Over the years, letters and messages continued to reach me, sometimes decades later, from doctors and nurses who had only heard the stories secondhand. They wrote of moments when a simple pause, a remembered phrase, or a cautious decision prevented disaster. They admitted how close they had come to repeating the arrogance of the past, how my restraint had become a silent guide. And I realized that this was the culmination of my mild revenge. It had outlasted memory, outgrown my presence, and turned into something larger than any one person. Arrogance no longer thrived unchecked, laughter at age or experience had lost its power, and humility had become instinct. The lives quietly saved, the careers quietly redirected, the choices made differently because someone once chose patience over retaliation. This was the legacy I had built. And in that knowledge, the old doctor rested fully, knowing that influence, once planted with wisdom and restraint, can ripple through generations, changing the world quietly, permanently, and beautifully. Even as the world around medicine evolved, new technology, faster procedures, younger, bolder doctors, the lessons I left continued to ripple through the halls. Residents who had never met me hesitated before acting too quickly, nurses spoke up with confidence, and decisions were guided by respect for experience rather than mere efficiency. I realized then that my mild revenge had become almost invisible, a quiet force that corrected arrogance before it could harm. It no longer relied on my presence, my voice, or my approval. It lived in the culture itself, in instincts, habits, and choices, saving countless lives without anyone ever realizing why. And in that understanding, I finally knew, true power does not come from defeating others, but from shaping them so they never need to be defeated, leaving behind a legacy that endures, subtle, unstoppable, and profoundly life-saving. And as the years continued to pass, I understood the final truth. My influence had become a silent guardian in every ward, every operating room, every decision made under pressure. Young doctors no longer laughed at experience, they remembered, they paused, they questioned, they respected. Mistakes that could have cost lives were avoided, careers were saved, and empathy became as critical a tool as any scalpel or machine. My mild revenge, gentle yet persistent, had outlived me. It was no longer about those who had mocked me, but about ensuring that arrogance could never harm where humility could guide. And in that quiet, enduring change, I found the deepest satisfaction, not in being proven right, not in witnessing regret, but in knowing that the world I left behind was safer, wiser, and infinitely more compassionate because I had chosen patience, restraint, and teaching over anger. And in the end, I realized that the lesson I had left behind had become bigger than me, bigger than any single hospital or doctor. It lived in the instincts of those who paused to listen, in the hands that worked carefully instead of quickly, in the eyes that noticed details others overlooked. Arrogance no longer had free rein. Respect for experience and humility had become the invisible scaffolding holding countless lives together. I understood that my mild revenge, delivered not through confrontation, but through patience, example, and quiet correction, had achieved immortality, for it would continue to shape behavior long after my name was forgotten. And in that enduring, subtle legacy, I found peace. True power is not in proving others wrong, but in ensuring that lives, decisions, and futures are forever guided by wisdom, empathy, and restraint. Even decades later, long after my presence was only a memory, I learned that the culture I had helped shape had become self-sustaining. New doctors arriving fresh from medical school instinctively respected senior guidance, questioned their own assumptions, and listened more than they spoke. Mistakes that once would have caused irreversible harm were caught in time, lives were saved without anyone realizing why. My mild revenge, once imagined as a subtle correction for those who had mocked me, had grown into something far greater, a living principle embedded into every action, every decision, and every choice. And as I reflected quietly on this, I understood fully that the true measure of influence is not in confrontation or punishment, but in the enduring change one inspires in others, a change that quietly ensures humility, respect, and wisdom continue to protect those who cannot yet see its value. And even as new generations of doctors came and went, the impact of those early lessons continued to manifest in unexpected ways. Stories of caution, reflection, and respect for experience were passed down from mentor to mentee, often without a single mention of my name, yet the principle endured. Decisions were slower, more deliberate, egos were tempered by the memory of what arrogance could cost. I realized that mild revenge, when delivered with patience and empathy rather than anger, does not end, it multiplies, shaping behavior, safeguarding lives, and quietly correcting a culture from within. In that subtle, persistent transformation, I found the ultimate satisfaction, a legacy that did not demand recognition, did not rely on fear, but lived on in every choice made with humility, empathy, and care. And as time went on, I noticed something even more profound. The lesson no longer needed to be consciously remembered to work. It had seeped into the very instincts of the medical staff, the pause before action, the double-checking of assumptions, the quiet respect for experience. These behaviors became automatic. Arrogance found no fertile ground, hesitation was no longer weakness but prudence, laughter at age or experience had been replaced by thoughtful attention. My mild revenge, once imagined as a personal correction, had transformed into a living safeguard, an invisible force shaping countless lives every day. And in that realization, I finally understood that the truest measure of one's life is not in victories or applause, but in the enduring changes made quietly in the world, changes that outlast memory, outlast names, and outlast the one who taught them. And even as the hospital evolved, with new technologies, new protocols, and new faces filling the halls, the lessons remained. The instinct to listen, to pause, to respect experience, had become a part of the very culture. Mistakes that could have been fatal were avoided, arrogance no longer went unchecked. I realized then that my mild revenge had become immortal, not as a story, not as a name on a plaque, but as a living ethic woven into daily practice. Every life saved, every career preserved, every moment of hesitation that prevented disaster was my legacy. And in that quiet, enduring transformation, I found the deepest peace, that true influence is not proven by confrontation, but by shaping the future so that wisdom, humility, and care continue to guide long after we are gone. And over the years, I came to understand that the influence I had left behind had grown far beyond my imagination. The young doctors who once mocked experience had now become mentors themselves, teaching patience, vigilance, and humility to the next generation. Nurses reminded colleagues to double-check, consultants encouraged questions, and even the fastest, most confident residents learned to pause before acting. My mild revenge had transformed into a self-sustaining force, a culture where arrogance could no longer thrive, where respect for experience and cautious wisdom became second nature. And in witnessing this quiet, unstoppable change, I finally understood that true victory does not come from retaliation or proving others wrong, it comes from creating a world where mistakes are fewer, lives are saved, and lessons endure, invisible but infinitely powerful. And in the quiet of my later years, I realized the full magnitude of what had been accomplished. My presence was no longer required to enforce respect or caution, the habits I had helped instill had taken root on their own. Young doctors instinctively sought guidance when unsure, nurses spoke up without hesitation, and even the most confident residents tempered their actions with reflection. Mistakes that might once have been disastrous were now caught before harm occurred. My mild revenge, once aimed at correcting mockery, had evolved into a living, breathing ethic that continued to shape decisions and save lives, long after I had gone. And in that enduring ripple, I found the deepest satisfaction. True power lies not in proving others wrong, but in quietly transforming a world so that wisdom, humility, and care continue to guide, generation after generation. And even beyond the walls of that hospital, the lesson I left behind began to influence other places, other teams, other practices. Stories of caution, respect, and humility spread quietly through conferences, trainings, and whispered advice between colleagues. Young doctors who had never seen me learned to value experience, to question assumptions, to pause and reflect, and mistakes that might have once gone unnoticed were caught in time. My mild revenge had become larger than any one hospital. It had become a principle, a safeguard woven into the very fabric of medical practice. And in that quiet, unstoppable legacy, I understood at last, the greatest impact is not measured in recognition or revenge, but in the enduring transformation of hearts, minds, and lives, long after the teacher has walked away. And as the years continued, I saw that the influence of a life lived with patience and restraint had multiplied in ways I could never have predicted. Doctors who once might have laughed at age or experience now instinctively respected it. Junior staff spoke up when something felt wrong, senior staff listened when caution was raised. Decisions became safer, outcomes better, and the culture itself shifted toward mindfulness and empathy. My mild revenge, delivered not in anger but in quiet guidance, had outlasted me, shaping actions, saving lives, and correcting arrogance without ever needing to confront it directly. And in that realization, I finally understood the deepest truth: the power of wisdom is eternal when it teaches others to act with care, humility, and compassion, and that legacy, subtle yet unstoppable, is the truest victory one can achieve. And in those final reflections, I understood that the real victory had never been personal. It was not about proving anyone wrong, nor about witnessing regret firsthand. It was about planting a seed, a lesson in humility, respect, and patience, that would grow quietly, unseen, yet transform countless lives. Each doctor who paused, each nurse who insisted, each decision guided by experience became a living testament to that seed. My mild revenge had evolved into something far greater than I ever imagined, a culture of care and wisdom that no arrogance could uproot. And in knowing that, I finally felt complete, realizing that true influence is measured not by confrontation or recognition, but by the enduring, invisible ways one shapes the future for the better. And even as decades passed, the lesson continued to thrive in ways I could never have foreseen. New generations of doctors, nurses, and trainees carried it forward instinctively. They questioned assumptions, double-checked procedures, and treated every patient with the care and humility I had tried to instill. Arrogance that once seemed unstoppable had no foothold, impatience no longer endangered lives. My mild revenge, once imagined as a subtle correction for those who had mocked me, had become something far greater, a self-sustaining culture of respect, vigilance, and empathy that quietly saved lives every day. And in that realization, I understood the ultimate truth: lasting influence is not won through anger or confrontation, but through the patient, persistent shaping of hearts, minds, and actions long after one is gone. And as I reflected on the decades that had passed, I realized the full scope of what had been accomplished. My presence was no longer required for respect to be shown, for caution to be exercised, or for empathy to guide decisions. The culture I had quietly nurtured had taken on a life of its own, protecting patients, guiding young doctors, and correcting arrogance before it could cause harm. Mistakes that might once have been catastrophic were caught in time. Lives were saved not because anyone demanded it, but because the lesson had become instinct. My mild revenge, once aimed at those who had mocked my age, had transformed into a living legacy, enduring and unstoppable. And in that understanding, I finally knew the deepest satisfaction: the truest victory lies not in retaliation, but in shaping a world where wisdom, humility, and care continue to guide every choice. And as the years stretched on, I realized something even more profound: my influence no longer depended on memory or acknowledgement. The lesson had woven itself into the very fabric of daily practice. Decisions were tempered with reflection, questions were encouraged, and respect for experience had become instinctive. Young doctors instinctively paused before acting, nurses spoke up without fear. And arrogance no longer found fertile ground. My mild revenge, once imagined as a quiet correction, had become immortal, living in countless choices, subtle actions, and saved lives. And in that enduring, unseen legacy, I finally understood: true power is not in proving others wrong, but in shaping a world so that wisdom, empathy, and restraint continue to guide, quietly, endlessly, and irreversibly. And even as time marched on, the impact of those early lessons only grew stronger. The young doctors who had once mocked experience had long since become mentors themselves, passing down the same principles of caution, respect, and humility. Nurses reminded colleagues to double-check, consultants encouraged questions, and even the most confident residents learned to pause before acting. My mild revenge had become more than a personal correction, it had become a living ethic, an invisible force shaping countless decisions and safeguarding lives. And in that quiet, unstoppable transformation, I finally understood the deepest truth: lasting influence is not earned through confrontation or punishment, but through patient guidance, unwavering integrity, and the subtle shaping of hearts and minds long after one is gone. And as I reflected on the decades that followed, I realized that my presence was no longer needed to enforce the lesson. It had become instinctual, embedded in the way doctors paused before acting, in the way nurses spoke up without hesitation, in the careful attention paid to every patient. Arrogance no longer flourished unchecked. Humility, patience, and respect had become the natural framework for action. My mild revenge, once meant for those who mocked me, had grown into something far greater, a living, enduring safeguard, quietly correcting behavior and saving lives every day. And in that understanding, I finally knew true satisfaction, that the most powerful impact is not measured by applause or retaliation, but by the invisible, lasting change one leaves in the world. And even as the years continued to pass, I saw the legacy of those lessons spreading further than I could have imagined. Doctors I had never met instinctively approached decisions with care, nurses reminded one another to double-check when something felt wrong, and the culture of respect for experience became a natural, unspoken part of the hospital's rhythm. My mild revenge, once aimed at correcting mockery, had transformed into an enduring force, shaping choices, guiding actions, and quietly saving lives without fanfare or recognition. And in that realization, I finally understood the full truth: the greatest power lies not in proving others wrong, but in leaving a world forever changed by wisdom, patience, and restraint. And as decades unfolded, I understood that my influence had taken on a life of its own. Even new generations who had never seen me learned to respect experience, to pause before acting, and to speak up when caution demanded it. Mistakes that could have been catastrophic were now avoided, arrogance had no room to grow, and humility became instinct. My mild revenge, once imagined as a subtle correction for those who mocked me, had become a living, self-sustaining force, quietly shaping behavior, safeguarding lives, and guiding hearts and minds. And in that quiet, enduring transformation, I finally realized the deepest satisfaction: true legacy is not in anger or confrontation, but in teaching the world to be wiser, kinder, and more careful long after we are gone. And over the years, I saw how far-reaching that quiet influence had become. Young doctors now instinctively consulted seniors, nurses reminded colleagues to double-check, and hesitation became a safeguard rather than a weakness. Arrogance, once tolerated, was now corrected by culture itself. My mild revenge, intended to teach respect rather than punish, had grown into an invisible guardian, shaping decisions, saving lives, and quietly guiding generations. And in that realization, I finally understood the ultimate truth: the greatest victory is not in being proven right, but in leaving a world that acts with wisdom, humility, and care long after we are gone. And even as decades passed, the influence continued to grow quietly, spreading beyond any single hospital or team. Doctors who had never met me still instinctively followed the lessons. They paused, they listened, they respected experience, and they acted with humility. Mistakes that might once have been disastrous were avoided, arrogance no longer thrived. My mild revenge, once imagined as a subtle correction for those who mocked me, had become a living ethic, shaping countless lives, decisions, and careers. And in that enduring, invisible legacy, I finally understood the deepest satisfaction: true power is not in proving others wrong, but in creating a world guided by wisdom, patience, and empathy, long after we are gone. And in the quietest moments of reflection, I realized the depth of what had truly been achieved. This was no longer about correcting mockery, or teaching respect for age. It had become a transformation of hearts and minds, a subtle reweaving of character that no one could ever fully see. Each pause, each question asked, each careful decision was now a thread in an invisible tapestry, protecting lives, shaping futures, and reminding everyone, without a single word, that arrogance carries consequences, and humility carries power. My mild revenge had transcended personal vindication. It had become moral architecture, a structure of restraint and empathy embedded in the very instincts of those who practiced medicine. And as I understood this, I felt a profound peace. True influence is not measured by who is punished, but by how profoundly lives are reshaped, quietly, irreversibly, for generations to come. And in that profound realization, I saw the true weight of time and experience, that every lesson once delivered in whispered correction or quiet demonstration had grown roots deep enough to alter the way people thought, acted, and lived. Young doctors who had never known my voice carried my principles in their hands and in their hearts. The mistakes they avoided, the lives they saved, the humility they practiced, they were all echoes of a subtle, patient guidance that demanded no recognition, no applause, no revenge born of anger. My influence had become immortal in its quietness, a force shaping character, decisions, and outcomes long after I was gone. And in that truth, I finally understood the deepest satisfaction of all, that wisdom, when shared with patience and care, becomes unstoppable, enduring, and transformative in ways no confrontation ever could. And as I reflected even further, I realized that the true depth of my legacy was not in individual successes or moments of recognition, but in the subtle, invisible shift of an entire culture. Arrogance no longer found fertile ground, impatience was tempered by reflection, mistakes that might once have gone unnoticed were caught in time. The young doctors who once mocked experience now instinctively carried forward lessons of humility and vigilance, mentoring others without realizing they were perpetuating a cycle I had begun decades before. My mild revenge had become more than a personal correction, it had become an enduring, living force, quietly guiding choices, shaping character, and safeguarding lives. And in that silent, unstoppable transformation, I understood the deepest truth: the most powerful impact is made not through confrontation, but through patient, persistent shaping of hearts and minds, leaving the world wiser, kinder, and safer long after we are gone. And in the stillness of my final reflections, I understood the full magnitude of what had been achieved. My presence was no longer needed to enforce respect or caution. The lesson had become instinct, woven into the very fabric of practice. Every hesitation, every question asked, every decision tempered with care was now a ripple of the guidance I had quietly offered decades before. Arrogance had no foothold, humility, patience, and vigilance had become second nature. My mild revenge, once imagined as a subtle correction for those who mocked me, had evolved into something far greater, a living, self-sustaining force that shaped countless lives without fanfare, applause, or recognition. And in that understanding, I finally felt complete, knowing that true influence is measured not by the moments we are seen, but by the invisible, enduring ways we change the world for the better. And as I looked back on the span of years, I realized the most profound lesson was how quietly power can work. The young doctors who had once mocked experience no longer needed correction. They instinctively paused, questioned, and listened. Nurses spoke up when something felt wrong. Even the fastest, most confident residents had learned to temper speed with caution. My mild revenge, never loud, never vengeful, had grown into an invisible current running through every hallway, every decision, every life touched. And in that quiet, unshakable transformation, I understood the ultimate truth: true legacy is not measured by victories over others, but by the enduring wisdom and empathy we leave behind, silently guiding generations long after we are gone. And in the final clarity of reflection, I realized the full scope of what had been achieved. The lesson I had imparted had outgrown me. It no longer needed my voice, my presence, or my insistence. Every pause before action, every question asked, every careful consideration had become instinct, a shield against arrogance, a safeguard for life. My mild revenge, once aimed at those who laughed at age or experience, had transformed into a living, self-perpetuating legacy, quietly shaping behavior, saving lives, and teaching humility without ever raising a voice. And in that profound realization, I felt complete. The truest power is not in proving others wrong, but in creating a world where wisdom, restraint, and empathy endure, guiding countless lives long after we ourselves have gone. And in the deepest moments of reflection, I finally understood the full meaning of what had unfolded over decades. My influence was no longer a matter of recognition or personal vindication. It had become something far greater, almost sacred. It had seeped into instincts, into decisions made in the quietest moments when no one was watching, into the rhythm of lives saved and careers guided, into the subtle choices that distinguish a competent doctor from a wise one. Arrogance that once mocked age and experience had been replaced by respect that no lecture could enforce, humility that no punishment could teach, and vigilance that no fear could demand. My mild revenge had achieved its highest purpose: not destruction, not fear, not humiliation, but the enduring transformation of hearts and minds, a living legacy that would continue to shape generations, prevent harm, and safeguard life long after my name was forgotten. And so, as I let go of the years I had carried, I felt a profound peace. The laughter that once sought to diminish me had become a whisper in history, replaced by understanding, care, and vigilance. The world I had touched would continue, quietly guided by the principles I had lived, proving that patience, restraint, and empathy are more powerful than anger, that true wisdom outlasts youth, and that the deepest revenge, the kind that saves lives and reshapes souls, requires no malice, only the courage to act rightly when it matters most. In that enduring truth, I finally rested, knowing that the legacy of a life well lived is not measured by applause or recognition, but by the countless unseen choices it inspires, the lives it touches, and the generations it quietly shapes toward humility, respect, and wisdom. And that is how the old doctor, once laughed at, finally triumphed, not through fury or revenge, but through a lifetime of patient, quiet influence that no one could ever take away.